This is Jacob Friedman.
If you were Michael Kovrig, you would have every right to demand that Canada never send a prime minister to Beijing ever again. You spent more than 1,000 days in a Chinese prison, a pawn in a geopolitical hostage game, cut off from the world, subjected to psychological torture, and used as leverage against your own country. If anyone has the moral authority to say that we should turn our backs on the People's Republic, to say that the cost of engagement is simply too high, it is him. So, when Prime Minister Mark Carney announced he was heading to China, the first visit by a Canadian leader in nearly a decade, you might have expected Kovrig to be the loudest voice in opposition. You might have expected him to rally the victims of Beijing's transnational repression and demand a boycott, but he didn't. In fact, he did the exact opposite. He went on national television and explicitly supported the trip. This moment, this specific counterintuitive endorsement is where the real story of Canada's future is being written. And yet, if you were just scrolling through the headlines this morning, you probably missed the profound shift it represents. You likely saw the standard hot takes. On one side, the business lobby is cheering for a reset, hoping to sell more canola and pork to the hungry Chinese market. On the other side, you have the hawks and the skeptics screaming that Carney is walking into a trap, that he is legitimizing a regime that kidnaps our citizens and interferes in our elections. Both of those narratives are comfortable. They fit into the binary boxes we have built for ourselves, trade versus human rights, profit versus principle, but they are both wrong. They both miss what Kovrig actually said, and more importantly, they miss the dark, complex reality that is forcing Carney onto that plane. We need to stop looking at this trip through the lens of 2015. We are not going back to the era of sunny ways and golden decades. What we are witnessing, and what Kovrig, perhaps more than any other Canadian, intimately understands, is a desperate, high-stakes recalibration of Canada's survival strategy in a world that has become openly hostile to middle powers. When Kovrig supports this trip, he isn't doing it out of forgiveness. He isn't doing it because he trusts the Chinese Communist Party. He is doing it because he knows exactly what they are capable of, and he knows that silence and isolation are no longer a shield. We are entering a new phase of global politics where the threats aren't just coming from our adversaries, but from the crumbling reliability of our traditional allies, and that leaves Canada in a precarious, terrifying position that requires a level of diplomatic sophistication we haven't had to flex in decades. Let's look at what is officially happening on the surface. Prime Minister Carney is in China to rebuild fractured relations. That is the diplomatic euphemism. The cameras will show handshakes, perhaps a stiff photo op with General Secretary Xi Jinping, and announcements about trade irritants. We will hear about canola farmers and electric vehicles. The surface story is that Canada is trying to balance its checkbook and smooth over the rough patch left by the Meng Wanzhou affair and the two Michaels. It sounds like a return to business as usual, a normalization of ties. But if you scratch that surface, the logic falls apart. You cannot normalize relations with a state that views your judicial system as a tool to be manipulated and your citizens as bargaining chips. You cannot simply go back to selling wheat as if the last 10 years didn't happen. So why is Carney really there? And why is Kovrig, the victim of that very system, nodding along? The answer lies in a concept Kovrig himself brought up, a phrase that doesn't usually make it onto the nightly news, but defines our current existence: weaponized interdependence. This is the system behind the smile. For a generation, we were told that integrating our economies with authoritarian regimes would make them more like us. We were told that trade would bring peace. Instead, what happened was that China, and to a different extent, other great powers, realized that if they control the nodes of the global economy, they can strangle you without ever firing a shot. They can target specific demographics in your country to break your political will. Kovrig pointed this out with chilling precision. He noted how Beijing leverages trade disputes to fuel political divides between Canada's agricultural provinces and its central manufacturing interests. This isn't just about tariffs. It is a strategy of subversion. They hurt the prairie farmers to make them angry at Ottawa. They squeeze the lobster fishermen to turn the Maritimes against foreign policy decisions made in the capital. When Carney steps off that plane, he isn't just a trade envoy. He is a leader trying to proof his country against this kind of internal fracturing. The system we are dealing with now is one where foreign powers actively map our domestic political fault lines and insert wedges into them. Kovrig's support for the trip is rooted in the realization that you cannot defend against this by ignoring it. You have to be in the room. You have to have the direct line to Xi Jinping, not because you are friends, but because the risk of miscalculation in a highly centralized authoritarian system is catastrophic. If the only time we talk to China is when they have already taken a hostage or slapped a tariff on us, we have already lost. We are reacting to their agenda. By going there, Carney is attempting to reestablish a baseline of communication that might prevent the next crisis from escalating into a total economic blockade or another arbitrary detention. But there is another layer here, one that makes this trip even more urgent and arguably more dangerous. It's the elephant in the room that Kovrig alluded to with diplomatic tact but unmistakable clarity. He spoke of an increasingly difficult to deal with United States. We need to pause and really digest what that means coming from a former diplomat. For our entire history as a nation, our security strategy was essentially to hug the United States as tight as possible. We outsourced our defense, our economic stability, and our geopolitical identity to Washington. That era is dead. With a resurgent, aggressive Russia and a chaotic, unpredictable America that views alliances as protection rackets, Canada is suddenly very lonely. We are sandwiched between a hostile superpower in the east and a volatile, unreliable superpower in the south. This is the hidden context of the Carney trip. It is a hedging strategy. We are not pivoting to China. We are trying to ensure we aren't crushed by the collision of these great powers. Kovrig talked about a whole of society response, and that is language usually reserved for war. He is telling us that the threat isn't just the Chinese state. The threat is our own naivety and our own internal divisions. The guardrails he speaks of, foreign influence registries, protections against espionage, diversifying our trade so we aren't dependent on a single buyer. These are the fortifications of a modern sovereign state. But you cannot build those fortifications if you are broke, and you cannot build them if your country is tearing itself apart because one region feels sacrificed for the interests of another. Who benefits from this trip? Ideally, it is the Canadian state, which gains a sliver of breathing room. It is the families of the other Canadians still detained in China, for whom Carney is now the only hope of advocacy. Kovrig mentioned them specifically. The nearly 100 other prisoners who didn't get the headlines he did. He knows that without a prime minister in the room, those people are ghosts, but there is a cost. The people who pay are those who thought we could take a purely moral stand, who thought we could simply boycott evil. The reality is that in this new Cold War, purity is a luxury we can no longer afford. We are forced to shake the hand that locked the cell door, not because we want to, but because the alternative is to leave our citizens and our economy defenseless against a giant that plays by no rules but its own. Carney's task, as Kovrig outlined, is to spread the pain around. That is a brutal phrase for a politician. It means acknowledging that we can't save everyone from the fallout of this geopolitical clash. We can't drop tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles without destroying the Ontario auto industry, but we can't let the prairie farmers starve because China retaliates. This is the messy, ugly work of governing in a polarized world. It's about managing losses. And that is why the media framing of this trip as a reset or a sellout is so dangerously simplistic. It encourages us to look for heroes and villains in a situation that is actually about survival mechanics. We are watching a prime minister try to thread a needle while the fabric of the global order is burning, and we are watching a man who was burned by that fire tell us that this is the only way forward. This is where the real danger lies. And it isn't just about ships in the Taiwan Strait or spy balloons drifting over the continent. It's about the subtle, corrosive way authoritarian regimes reach inside democratic societies and turn us against ourselves. Kovrig was explicit about this mechanism. describing how Beijing looks for the vulnerable points and presses on them. This is a strategy of calculated division. When China slaps tariffs on our canola or our pork, they aren't just trying to hurt our GDP. They are trying to hurt specific Canadian provinces to manipulate our domestic political map. They know that if they squeeze the prairie farmers hard enough, those farmers will get angry, not necessarily at China, but at Ottawa. They know that if they block seafood exports, it fuels resentment in the Maritimes. They are weaponizing our own regional fault lines, turning the legitimate economic anxieties of Albertans or Nova Scotians into leverage for the Chinese Communist Party. And frankly, it works. We have seen it work. We have seen how quickly trade disputes mutate into federal-provincial wars. Kovrig warns that Beijing uses these levers to fuel political divides, pitting our agricultural interests against our manufacturing base, effectively holding one group of Canadians hostage to force concessions from another. This is why the Prime Minister's trip is so fraught with peril. He isn't just negotiating trade deals, he is trying to manage a national unity crisis that is being stoked from across the ocean. The challenge, as Kovrig put it, is to spread the pain around. That is a hard truth that no politician wants to say out loud. It means admitting that we cannot protect everyone perfectly. If we want to shield our auto sector and our industrial future from a flood of cheap, state-subsidized Chinese electric vehicles, we have to keep tariffs in place. But doing that invites retaliation against our farmers. So the question becomes, how do we act as a nation rather than a collection of vulnerable competing industries? Kovrig argues that we need to stop sacrificing one group of Canadians for another. We need to diversify so that no single sector is selling 90% of its goods to a country that views trade as a weapon. But more than that, we need to understand the concept of elite capture. This is one of the darkest aspects of the modern influence game, and it's something Kovrig alluded to when he spoke about the risk of infiltration and the need for a whole-of-society response. Elite capture doesn't necessarily mean people are being bribed with bags of cash. It's more subtle. It's about cultivating relationships with former politicians, business tycoons, and academic leaders, people who then become unwitting or sometimes witting proxies, advocating for Beijing's interests in the corridors of power because their own personal fortunes or institutional funding are tied to continued access. This is why the guardrails Kovrig mentioned are not just bureaucratic buzzwords. They are the immune system of our democracy. He spoke specifically about a foreign influence registry. Now you will hear a lot of noise about this. Critics will try to frame it as discriminatory or a return to McCarthyism, but look at who is asking for it. It isn't a xenophobic demagogue. It is a man who spent nearly 3 years in a Chinese cell. He sees a registry not as a tool of oppression, but as a basic transparency measure, a way to simply know who is working for whom. If you are lobbying our government on behalf of a foreign power, the Canadian public has a right to know. It is about bringing those shadows into the light so that we can see the strings being pulled. Without these protections, without defense against espionage, IP theft, and transnational repression, opening our doors wider to trade is effectively inviting a fox into the henhouse and hoping he's gone vegetarian. We also have to talk about the psychological trap that our leaders keep falling into, something Kovrig diagnosed as historical amnesia. There is this persistent, seductive delusion in the West that China has changed or that it will change if we just talk to them nicely enough. We look at a slight thaw in relations, a willingness to meet, and we think, oh, good, the bad times are over. Kovrig shattered that illusion in seconds. He reminded us that China hasn't changed. The system that took him hostage is the exact same system Carney is visiting today. The only thing that changed is the calculation in Xi Jinping's head. China's economy is struggling. They have a youth unemployment crisis, a property market collapse, and they are locked in a grinding rivalry with the United States. They aren't talking to us because they have seen the light. They are talking to us because they need us again. This is a critical distinction. If we go into these meetings thinking we are dealing with a partner who shares our values, we will get eaten alive. We have to recognize that this is a transaction born of necessity, not a meeting of minds. The success of this trip, as Kovrig defined it, should be modest, concrete, and reversible. That we shouldn't be looking for a grand reset or a new era of friendship. We should be looking for small wins, lifting punitive tariffs, getting better consular access for our detained citizens, maybe reopening a dialogue on climate. But everything must be verifiable. Everything must be reversible. If we drop our guard, if we let the lure of the Chinese market blind us to the security risks again, we are doomed to repeat the cycle of the last decade. And let's be clear about who pays the price when we get this wrong. It isn't the politicians flying in business class or the corporate executives signing deals in Shanghai. It is the ordinary citizens who get caught in the gears. It is the researcher whose intellectual property gets stolen, bankrupting their startup. It is the diaspora community activist who faces harassment and threats here on Canadian soil because the foreign interference laws are too weak to protect them. It is the farmer who suddenly loses their livelihood because a diplomatic spat thousands of miles away closed the border to their crop. And in the most extreme and tragic cases, it is people like Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor who pay with their freedom when a middle power gets squeezed between giants. This brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all. Our own naivety is a national security risk. Kovrig said that Canadians need to do more to educate themselves. That is a polite way of saying we have been asleep at the wheel. We have treated foreign policy as a spectator sport, something that happens over there, unrelated to our daily lives. But in a world of weaponized interdependence, foreign policy is domestic policy. The decisions made in Beijing or Washington directly determine the price of your groceries, the stability of your job, and the safety of your community. We can no longer afford to be passive. We need policymakers who actually understand China, not just the market opportunities, but the language, the history, and the strategic culture of the Communist Party. Kovrig noted a lack of this expertise, and that gap is a gaping wound in our defenses. We are sending amateurs to play chess against grandmasters, and we are wondering why we keep losing pieces. The media, for its part, often fails to convey these stakes. You'll see the headlines focus on the optics of the trip. Was the handshake warm? Did Carney look strong? Did he get a win? This is political theater disguised as analysis. It treats diplomacy like a sporting event where the score is settled at the final whistle. But the real game is long, slow, and largely invisible. It's about resilience. It's about whether we can build a society that is cohesive enough to withstand the pressure that is inevitably coming. When Beijing tries to divide us, do we fracture or do we hold the line? Kovrig's advice was to band together. It sounds simple, almost trite, but in this context, it is a radical act of defiance. It means a premier in Alberta has to care about the industrial base in Ontario, and a voter in Toronto has to care about the agricultural exports of Saskatchewan. If we allow ourselves to be sliced up by sectoral interests, we are easy pickings. Ultimately, this trip is a test of our maturity as a nation. Are we capable of holding two contradictory thoughts in our heads at the same time? Can we trade with China while simultaneously defending ourselves against it? Can we shake hands with a regime that represses its own people while steadfastly protecting our own democratic norms? It is a tightrope walk over a canyon, and there is no safety net. Carney is out there on the wire right now, and while we can debate the wisdom of the step, we have to recognize the gravity of the fall. The recalibration Kovrig speaks of is not just about diplomatic protocols. It is about ending the era of innocence. It is about waking up to the harsh reality that in the 21st century, being a nice, polite country is not a survival strategy. You have to be smart, you have to be tough, and you have to be united, or you will be broken. The connection between this specific diplomatic mission and the deeper logic of our current political moment. We are living through a time where the very definition of what it means to be a nation is being tested. The culture wars that consume our social media feeds, the fights over identity, history, and values are not happening in a vacuum. They are being watched and they are being exploited. Authoritarian regimes know that a divided, distracted, and polarized society is weak. They know that if we are busy fighting each other over pronouns or statues, we won't notice when they buy up our critical minerals or infiltrate our research labs. Kovrig's whole of society warning is a plea for us to realize that our internal discord is a national security liability. We have to understand that this is not an accident. The situation we are in, where a Canadian Prime Minister has to go hat in hand to a superpower that kidnaps our citizens, is the result of a specific worldview that prevailed for 30 years. It is the result of the neoliberal fantasy that we could divorce economics from politics, that we could trade with anyone and everyone without consequences. We stripped the morality out of our markets, and now we are shocked to find that the market has no morals. We hollowed out our own industrial capacity in search of cheaper goods, and now we are held hostage by the supply chains we created. Carney's trip is not a new beginning. It is a desperate attempt to patch up a ship that was built with a fatal design flaw. And this flaw is not just about China. It is about the fragility of democratic systems in the face of patient long-term authoritarian strategy. While we think in 4-year election cycles, they think in decades. While we worry about the next news cycle, they are mapping out the next century. They have a strategy. Do we? Or are we just reacting, scrambling, and hoping for the best? As we watch the Prime Minister navigate these meetings, we need to see it for what it is, a symptom of a much deeper malaise. It is the symptom of a democracy that forgot it has enemies and forgot that freedom is not free. It requires constant, vigilant, and sometimes costly defense. The critical reflection we must offer here is that none of this is inevitable. We were not destined to end up in this position. We ended up here because of choices. Choices to prioritize short-term gain over long-term security, choices to ignore the warnings of dissidents and exiles, choices to believe the comfortable lie rather than face the uncomfortable truth. And now the bill has come due. The pain that Kovrig says must be spread around is the interest on that debt. And unless we change the way we think about power, money, and loyalty, we are going to keep paying it generation after generation. This trip serves as a mirror. It forces us to look at ourselves and ask, what are we willing to sell and what is not for sale? If the answer is everything has a price, then we have already lost. But if there are things, rights, values, people that we refuse to barter, then we need to start acting like it. We need to stop pretending that we can have it both ways. The era of easy choices is over. The era of hard choices has begun. This is Jacob Friedman signing off.